the reason that we don't focus on defining it is because it's really difficult to define. And when we start defining it, um, uh, not some of that conversation is positive. Some of that conversation isn't useful. It's not productive.
Okay.
And so I sort of enjoy those debates. I enjoy that conflict and contest. But the new history of capitalism looks at capitalism as what's called a synthetic lens. So it's a lens that allows historians to look at broad histories in a focused way, um, rather than trying to say, here's capitalism, this isn't capitalism. Um, so maybe I'll give you a couple of examples. So uh, there's a scholar, Christy Ford Chapin, who writes on the history of capitalism and the history of medicine. She sees capitalism in ancient Egypt. She sees capitalism in medieval England, and she sees capitalism in modern medical in the modern medical industry in Germany and England and the United States. I fundamentally disagree with uh, the first two. I don't see capitalism in ancient Egypt. I don't see capitalism in medieval England. I see markets in ancient Egypt. I see supply and demand in medieval England, but I don't see capitalism. An opposite example. So I just had Andrew Liu come and talk about his book Tea War for the grad students at ASU, and one of his uh, key interventions in the history of capitalism is he says, when you look at tea in China and India in the 19th century and even before, scholars for a long time have said, this is a backward, um, you know, um, non-innovative, anti-industrial society. So capitalism isn't here. But Andy looks at it and says, yeah, but what we see here are not necessarily the traditional hallmarks of capitalism, but we see these people operating under uh, characteristics, under dynamics that are created in the global marketplace that exploit local labor for the sake of increasingly efficient production to meet abstract market demand, right? And so he sees these specific characteristics of capitalism in play in a place that traditionally isn't thought of as being capitalist at this time, and I agree with him, right? And so thinking about what capitalism is and what capitalism isn't is useful, but defining it can often mean we become sort of blinded, put blinders on, and end up not seeing how similar dynamics shape um, different places differently, right? And so I was just at the business history conference this year, and we had a big discussion about, is the term capitalism a useful term of analysis, or is it not anymore? Should we be calling it political economy? My take on that is that as a professor, if you teach a class on political economy, very few students will show up. Whereas if you teach a class on the history of capitalism, students tend to be interested. So those classes fill. So even just from a practical standpoint, I think capitalism is a useful term to use. But I also think it points to something that is specific. I think the term is useful. The term is useful because it points to something that we're all familiar with, even if it's difficult to put it in a tidy box and put a bow on it and say this is the history of capitalism. So I think it's a useful term. I think it's useful to think about what capitalism is, even if we're resistant to offering a definitive definition.